There comes a moment in every parent's life when they must choose between tradition and love, and sometimes they choose wrong. When 17-year-old Inga needed her family most, they turned their backs on her, casting her into the wilderness, to die alone and pregnant. In a harsh northern village, shame can be deadlier than winter itself. But sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. In this case, from Halvar, a massive former Viking warrior living alone in the forest. Haunted by his own losses, what starts as one man's simple act of mercy becomes a story of healing for two broken souls. Through the long, brutal months ahead, Inga and Halvar will discover that family isn't always about blood, and that sometimes the strongest bonds are forged in the crucible of shared pain. But when her vengeful village discovers their sanctuary, will this unlikely protector find the courage to fight one more battle, not for conquest, but for the chance to save a life that has come to mean everything to him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wooden cross felt warm against Inga's palm as she pressed it to her chest, her grandfather's rough carving offering the only comfort in a world that had turned cold as winter stone. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, listening to the heated voices beyond the thin wooden door that separated her from the family meeting that would decide her fate. "She has brought shame upon our house." Her father's voice cut through the timber like an axe through kindling. Magnus Eriksson had built his reputation on honor and tradition, and his daughter's swollen belly threatened to topple everything he had worked to construct in their small northern village of Ravenshollow. Her mother's voice, barely a whisper, tried to find space between the men's declarations. "She is still our daughter, Magnus, still our blood. Blood that runs tainted now," came the harsh reply of her uncle Bjorn, whose opinion carried weight in the village council. "The girl has lain with some traveling merchant, or worse, and refuses to name the father. What honorable man would touch her now? What family would welcome alliance with ours?" Inga closed her eyes, remembering the night that had changed everything. Eric had been so gentle, so different from the crude village boys who pulled at her dress and made crude jokes about her fuller figure. He had spoken of love, of taking her away from this place, where whispers followed her like hungry dogs. She had believed him, had given herself willingly under the summer stars, thinking she had found someone who saw past her appearance to the heart that beat so fiercely within. He had vanished before the first snow, leaving only promises as empty as the wind that now howled through the gaps in the walls. "The child she carries is bastard-born," her eldest brother Thorstein declared with the authority of his 25 years. "To keep her here invites the judgment of the gods themselves. Already the harvest has been poor. Already 3 children have taken fever this winter." Inga pressed the cross harder against her chest, feeling the familiar grooves her grandfather's knife had carved decades before her birth. Olaf Eriksson had been a different kind of man than his son, quieter, kinder, with hands that built rather than destroyed. He had given her this cross on her 7th birthday, pressing it into her small palm with words she carried still. "Faith, little one, is not about the crowd that surrounds you on sunny days. Faith is what keeps your heart beating when you stand alone in the storm." The storm had arrived indeed. Through her small window, Inga could see the village beyond, the cluster of wooden houses that seemed to huddle together against the endless cold, smoke rising from chimneys like prayers seeking heaven. Ravenshollow had been her entire world for 17 years, every path and stone familiar as her own reflection. The blacksmith's forge where her childhood friend Astrid's father hammered iron into tools and horseshoes. The market square where traveling merchants sometimes brought news and goods from distant lands. the great hall where the village elders gathered to make decisions that shaped their small community's fate. She had walked these paths as a child, played in the shadow of the ancient oak that stood at the village center, learned to weave and cook and tend gardens under her mother's careful guidance. The other children had sometimes been cruel about her size, but there had been sanctuary in her family's walls, protection in her father's reputation as a fair and honorable man. That protection was crumbling now like walls built on shifting ground. "She cannot stay," Magnus spoke with finality. "The council has spoken. The village cannot harbor one who has violated our laws and customs so brazenly." "She is 17, her mother pleaded. "Where would she go? How would she survive?" "That is no longer our concern," Bjorn replied coldly. "She made her choice when she opened her legs to some stranger. Let her find another stranger to care for her bastard spawn." The cruel words hit Inga like physical blows. She doubled over, one hand protecting the life growing within her, the other clutching the cross until its edges bit into her palm. The baby stirred as if sensing her distress, a flutter of movement that reminded her she was no longer responsible only for herself. "I will speak with her," her father announced. "She has until dawn to gather what she can carry and leave. The village will not shelter her beyond that." Footsteps approached the door. Inga straightened, wiping tears from her cheeks and tucking the cross beneath her woolen dress. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her completely broken, though inside she felt as fragile as ice over deep water. The door opened to reveal Magnus Eriksson, his weathered face carved into harsh lines by disappointment and rigid principle. At 52, he remained an imposing figure. Broad shoulders that had swung axe and hammer in service to the community, hands that had built their house board by board, eyes that had once looked upon his only daughter with something approaching tenderness. Those eyes held nothing now but cold judgment. "You know what has been decided," he said without preamble. "You have brought dishonor to our family and our village. You will leave at first light and not return. Father, please, I am no longer your father." The words fell like stones into still water. A daughter of mine would not have shamed herself and us in such a manner. A daughter of mine would have chosen death before disgrace. Inga felt something break inside her chest. Some essential cord that had connected her to this man, to this place, to the identity she had carried for 17 years. "What of the child I carry? Does your grandchild mean nothing to you?" Magnus's face remained unmoved. "That bastard is no kin of mine. May the gods have mercy on its soul, for it will find none in this world." He turned to leave, then paused at the threshold. "Your mother has prepared a pack with what supplies we can spare. Do not expect more kindness than that. It is more than you deserve." When the door closed behind him, Inga sank to her knees on the rough wooden floor. The cross fell from her numb fingers, clattering against the boards like the last sound of her childhood ending. Outside, the wind howled louder, as if the very elements sensed the storm about to engulf one small, frightened girl who had dared to love and been condemned for it. She picked up the cross with trembling fingers, holding it against her lips as she whispered her grandfather's name into the darkness. Somewhere in the growing life within her, she found the strength to stand again, to face whatever morning would bring. By dawn, the girl who had been Inga Eriksson would cease to exist. What would emerge from that death, she could not yet imagine. But the child she carried deserved a chance at life, even if that life began in exile and uncertainty. The cross grew warm again in her palm, a small comfort against the vast cold that waited beyond these walls. "Faith," her grandfather had said, "was what kept your heart beating when you stood alone in the storm. The storm was here. Her heart, somehow, kept beating." Dawn came grey and merciless, painting the world in shades of ash and bone. Inga stood at the threshold of the only home she had ever known, a threadbare pack across her shoulders and her grandfather's cross burning like an ember against her heart. The torn fabric of her winter cloak, the same deep blue her mother had dyed with precious berries 3 summers past, caught on the doorframe as she stepped into exile. Her mother waited in the shadows just beyond the door, tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. Ingrid Eriksson had aged years in a single night, her auburn hair streaked with premature silver, her hands wringing a kitchen cloth as if she could squeeze forgiveness from rough linen. "Here," her mother whispered, pressing a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth into Inga's hands. "Dried meat and bread, not much, but enough, woman." Magnus's voice cut through the morning air like a blade through flesh. He stood behind his wife, fully dressed despite the early hour, his face set in the same harsh lines that had marked it the night before. "You've already shown her more mercy than she deserves." Inga tucked the bundle into her pack, her fingers numb from more than cold. "Mother, Go!" Ingrid whispered, her voice breaking. "Go now, before the village wakes." But the village was already stirring. Smoke rose from chimneys as families tended their hearth fires, and Inga caught glimpses of faces at windows, neighbors who had known her since birth, watching her final moments as a daughter of Ravenshollow, with expressions ranging from pity to contempt. Magnus stepped forward, blocking the morning light. "You know the paths through the forest better than most. Follow the stream northeast until you reach the trading route. Perhaps some merchant caravan will take pity on you." He spoke as if discussing the disposal of refuse, his tone empty of any recognition that he was condemning his own flesh and blood to probable death. The nearest village lay 3 days' walk through wilderness that claimed even experienced hunters, and winter had turned the forest into a graveyard, decorated with "Snow, please, father, I have no daughter." The words fell final as a headsman's axe. "Go now, before I set the dogs on you." Inga pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, feeling the fabric tear further where it had caught. The wool that had once kept her warm through countless winters now seemed as thin as hope itself. She turned away from the house, away from the faces that watched from shadows, and walked toward the tree line where the forest waited like an open mouth. Her feet found the familiar path that led to the stream, boots crunching through snow that glittered deceptively beautiful in the pale light. She had walked this way countless times as a child, gathering berries in summer, collecting firewood in autumn, setting snares for rabbits when meat ran scarce. The forest had been a place of adventure then, full of secret places and imagined kingdoms. Now it felt like a tomb. The stream chattered beside the path, its voice the only sound in the frozen world beyond her labored breathing. Ice formed thick shelves along the banks, and more than once her foot broke through the crust, soaking her boot in water that bit like liquid fire. Her grandfather's cross swung against her chest with each step, a steady rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Hours passed. The village fell behind until even the smoke from its chimneys vanished from view. Inga's breath came in painful puffs, and the child in her womb seemed to sense her distress, pressing against her ribs as if seeking escape. From the fear that consumed her, the path grew treacherous as morning stretched toward afternoon. Snow began to fall, not the gentle flakes of a peaceful winter day, but hard pellets driven by wind that cut through her inadequate clothing like needles through silk. Her cloak, already damaged from catching on the doorframe, tore further on, reaching branches that seemed to grab at her with skeletal fingers. By the time the sun reached its weak peak, Inga could no longer feel her feet. Her hands, even tucked deep in her sleeves, had gone numb, past pain. The baby's movements had slowed, and she pressed both palms against her belly, trying to share what little warmth remained in her body. "Stay with me," she whispered to the child. "Please, little one, stay strong." The stream beside her had grown wider, its voice louder as smaller brooks joined its course. This was good. It meant she was following the right path toward the trading route her father had mentioned. But the route seemed impossibly distant, and her legs felt like lead weights with each step. She stumbled, catching herself on a snow-laden pine branch that dumped its burden down her back. The cold shock stole her breath, and for a moment she stood gasping, watching her life's essence steam away in the frigid air. Everything hurt. Her feet, her back, her heart most of all. The wind picked up, driving the snow horizontally now, turning the world white and featureless. Inga could barely see the stream beside her, could barely make out the path that had become her lifeline. She pressed forward, one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant her child would never draw breath. Then her foot found nothing but air. The bank had eroded, leaving a gap hidden by snow. Inga pitched forward, her pack pulling her off balance, and tumbled toward the icy water below. She hit the stream with a splash that seemed to echo through the forest, water so cold it drove the air from her lungs in a scream that no one would hear. The current seized her immediately, pulling her downstream with frightening strength. Her pack became an anchor, dragging her beneath the surface, and she struggled to free herself from the straps, even as the cold sent her into paralytic shock. Water filled her nose and mouth, tasting of pine and earth and imminent death. She broke. The surface once, gasping, her arms flailing for anything solid to grasp. A fallen log swept past, too far to reach. Her cloak, heavy with water, wrapped around her legs like burial shrouds. The cross around her neck had somehow worked free and floated before her eyes, her grandfather's final gift, now a witness to her drowning. "Please," she whispered to whatever gods might listen to the prayers of outcast girls. "Please, not the baby. Let the baby live." The current swept her around a bend, and her body struck a boulder with force that sent starbursts across her vision. She felt something warm mixing with the cold water, blood from a gash in her forehead. Her strength was leaving her, flowing away like water through cupped hands. She managed to catch a branch overhanging the stream, bark rough against her numb palms, but she couldn't pull herself up, couldn't find the strength to fight the current any longer. Her grip began to slip, fingers too cold to close properly around her lifeline. This was how it would end then. Not in the warmth of her bed surrounded by family, but alone in freezing water, her child dying with her because a moment of love had been deemed unforgivable sin. Her grip failed. The current took her again, spinning her like driftwood toward whatever waited downstream. She closed her eyes, pressed her hands to her belly one final time, and prepared to join her grandfather in whatever realm awaited beyond this painful world. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was a massive shadow moving through the trees along the bank, something that might have been human, or might have been a fever dream born of dying hope. Her blood-stained cloak spread behind her like spilled wine as the stream carried her toward whatever fate awaited in the wilderness that had become her grave. Warmth. That was the first sensation that penetrated the fog of Inga's consciousness. Warmth, like sunlight on summer stones, like her mother's kitchen hearth on winter mornings, like life itself flowing back into limbs that had surrendered to death. She opened her eyes to dancing shadows cast by firelight against rough wooden walls. A hand-carved bowl sat beside her on a small table, steam rising from broth that smelled of herbs and meat. The scent made her stomach clench with hunger so fierce it bordered on pain. Where was she? Memory returned in fragments. The stream, the terrible cold, her family's rejection, the shadow moving through the trees. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as her head spun and nausea rolled through her belly. Easy. The voice came from somewhere near the fire, deep as distant thunder, careful as a man handling fragile glass. You nearly died. Your body needs time to remember how to live. Inga turned her head slowly, blinking to clear her vision. In the chair beside the hearth sat the largest man she had ever seen. He would have had to duck to pass through most doorways, his shoulders broad enough to block out sunlight, hands that could probably span her waist. Grey streaked his dark beard, and the long hair pulled back from a face carved by weather and time into harsh angles, but his eyes, pale blue like winter sky, held no threat. Instead, she saw something that might have been understanding, or perhaps recognition of shared pain. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely stronger than smoke. "Halvar." He gestured toward the bowl. "You should eat. You've been unconscious. For 2 days. 2 days." The child. Inga's hands flew to her belly, relief flooding through her as she felt the familiar flutter of movement within. The baby, lives. Halvar's voice carried gentle certainty. Strong heartbeat. Determined, like its mother. He rose from his chair with surprising grace for such a massive frame, moving to the small kitchen area where pots simmered over a separate cooking fire. Everything about the cabin spoke of a man who had learned to live alone. Simple but well-made furniture, tools arranged with military precision, not a single object that served mere decoration rather than purpose. "Where are we?" Inga asked, accepting the bowl he placed in her hands. The carved wood felt smooth as silk, polished by years of use. "My home, deep in the forest, far from villages and their judgments." He returned to his chair, settling with a sigh that suggested old bones protesting against cold weather. "I heard you cry out as the stream carried you past. Thought you were a wounded deer at first. The broth tasted like salvation itself, rich with bone marrow, fragrant with wild herbs that grew only in the deepest woods." Inga had never tasted anything so perfectly warming, so exactly what her body craved. She found herself drinking greedily, barely pausing for breath. "Slowly," Halvar cautioned. "Your stomach has been empty too long." She forced herself to sip rather than gulp, though every instinct screamed at her to consume everything within reach. "You saved my life." Perhaps. He stared into the fire, and she caught something in his expression, a weight that suggested saving lives was not something he did lightly or often. "Or perhaps I merely delayed the inevitable. Winter is harsh here. Food is scarce." "A pregnant woman? I can work," Inga interrupted, setting down the bowl with hands that only trembled slightly. "I can cook, clean, tend fires. I'm not afraid of hard labor." Halvar's pale gaze settled on her, studying her face with the intensity of a hunter tracking prey. "Running from something?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Inga could lie, could spin some tale of accident or misfortune, but something in his eyes suggested he would see through any deception, and besides, she was too tired for pretense. "My family cast me out, unmarried, pregnant. I brought shame to their house." The words came easier than expected, as if speaking them aloud somehow lessened their power to wound. "They gave me until dawn to leave and never return." "Ah." Halvar nodded slowly, as if this explained everything. Honor and tradition, the old ways that bind us to paths we might not choose ourselves. "You sound as if you understand." His laugh held no humor. "I understand what it means to be cast out, yes, to have the world you knew close its doors against you." He gestured toward the walls around them. "This has been my world for 15 years. No visitors, no word from outside, just me and the forest and the memories that follow a man wherever he goes." "What did you do?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately regretted the intrusion. But Halvar didn't seem offended. Instead, he stared deeper into the fire, as if seeking answers in the dancing flames. "I was a warrior once, served a lord who valued conquest over mercy, strength over wisdom. I followed orders that seemed honorable. At the time, protecting what was ours, punishing those who threatened our people. His voice grew distant, hollow. But violence has a way of consuming everything it touches. Eventually, I became something I couldn't live with. So I walked away from that life and found this place where my past couldn't follow. Does it work? Hiding from what you were? No. The admission came swift and certain. The past lives in here, he touched his chest, and no amount of distance can change what was done. But a man can choose what he does with the time remaining to him. He can choose to be something other than what he was. Inga finished the broth, feeling strength seep back into her limbs like sap rising in spring trees. My mother named me after a goddess of peace. Ironic, considering how much conflict I've brought to everyone around me. Peace is earned, not given, Halvar said quietly. Sometimes the path to it leads through storms that seem impossible to survive. She studied his face, the scars that marked his jaw, the calluses on hands that had clearly known both violence and craftsmanship, the way he held himself with the careful control of someone accustomed to being feared. Yet he had pulled her. From the stream, tended her fever, shared his food and shelter without asking for anything in return. "Why did you help me?" she asked. Halvar was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "Because once, when I needed help, no one came. Because mercy is a rare thing in this world, and perhaps—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Perhaps it's never too late to become the person you should have been all along." Outside, wind rattled the shutters and snow whispered against the windows. But inside, by the warmth of his fire, with broth warming her belly and blankets soft around her shoulders, Inga felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Safety. Not the conditional safety of family that could be withdrawn for violations. Of honor, but the simple safety of being seen as human by another human being. "Thank you," she whispered. Halvar nodded once, then reached for a piece of wood to add to the fire. In the growing flames, shadows danced like promises of warmth through whatever winter still lay ahead. The ancient axe hung above the fireplace, like a sleeping predator, its blade scarred by countless battles, its handle worn smooth by hands that had once dealt death with practiced efficiency. Inga found herself staring at it often in the days that followed her rescue, wondering what stories it could tell if weapons could speak. "That belonged to my father," Halvar said one morning, noticing her gaze as he prepared their simple breakfast, of porridge and dried meat, and his father before him, 3 generations of warriors who believed strength came from the ability to take life. "And now?" Inga asked, accepting the wooden bowl he offered. She had grown stronger in the week since awakening in his cabin, strong enough to help with small tasks, despite his protests that she should rest. "Now I think strength comes from choosing not to use it." He settled into his chair with the careful movements of a man whose body carried the accumulated damage of decades. "That axe hasn't tasted blood in 15 years. I pray it never will again." The admission surprised her. In her village, weapons were symbols of pride, displayed prominently, and maintained with religious devotion. Men spoke constantly of their prowess in battle, even if most had never faced anything more dangerous than a wild boar. "What changed?" she asked. Halvar stared at the axe, and she saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "I learned the difference between protection and destruction. Took me far too long and cost far too much." He didn't elaborate, but Inga had begun to recognize the signs of old pain in his voice, the slight pause before certain words, the way his eyes went distant when memory intruded on the present. She had her own wounds that ached at unexpected moments, her own subjects that made breathing difficult. "Tell me about the father," Halvar said suddenly, startling her from her thoughts. "The one who gave you the child you carry." Heat rose in her cheeks. They had shared meals and quiet conversations for days, but this was territory they hadn't explored. The circumstances that had led to her exile and near death in the wilderness. "His name was Eric," she said finally, "a merchant's son from the southern territories. He came to our village last summer with a trading caravan, silks and spices and stories of distant lands. And he seemed different from the local boys. It wasn't a question. Halvar spoke with the certainty of someone who understood how hearts could be captured by the promise of escape from familiar disappointments. He was gentle, Inga said, surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. Or seemed to be. He spoke of love, of taking me away from a place where whispers followed me like hungry dogs. I was foolish enough to believe him. Being hopeful isn't the same as being foolish, isn't it? She set down her spoon, appetite forgotten. He vanished before the first snow, leaving only empty promises, and this, she gestured toward her, rounded belly. My parents were right to be ashamed. Your parents were wrong. Halvar's voice carried quiet conviction. Shame belongs to the one who broke his word, not the one who gave her trust in good faith. Inga looked up, meeting his pale blue gaze. You speak as if you know something about broken promises. I know what it means to disappoint people who believed in you. He rose from his chair, moving to the window that looked out over snow-covered pines. I know what it's like to realize you've become something you swore you'd never be. She wanted to ask more, to understand the shadows that sometimes crossed his expression when he thought she wasn't watching. But she had learned that Halvar shared information like a miser spending coins, reluctantly and only when the moment felt right. Instead, she stood and began clearing their breakfast bowls, moving carefully around the small space. The baby had grown more active in recent days, pressing against her ribs and making simple tasks more challenging. But she needed to contribute something to their shared survival, needed to feel useful rather than merely rescued. You don't have to, Halvar began. I want to help. She carried the bowls to the wash basin, noting how he had arranged everything within easy reach, despite his towering height. The cabin showed evidence of long solitude, not the desperate disorder of a hermit, but the careful precision of a man who had learned to rely entirely on himself. You saved my life. The least I can do is wash a few bowls. She scrubbed the wooden vessels with soap he had made from animal fat and wood ash, trying to ignore the way her back ached from leaning over the basin. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly sharp kick to her kidney, making her gasp and press a hand to her side. Are you fine? She said quickly. But Halvar was already beside her, his massive hands hovering uncertainly, as if he wanted to help, but didn't know. When is the baby due? Spring, I think. Late spring, if I've counted correctly. She dried her hands on a rough towel, suddenly aware of how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. I never imagined I'd be bringing a child into the world. So far from everything I've ever known. Children adapt, Halvar said quietly. They find ways to thrive in places adults would consider impossible. You sound as if you speak from experience. Again, that tightening around his eyes that suggested old wounds. Once, perhaps. Long ago. He moved away before she could respond, busying himself with banking the fire and preparing for the day's activities. But Inga had caught something in his tone. A grief so deep it had worn smooth with time, like river stones polished by decades of current. She wanted to press, to understand what had carved such careful distance into this man who showed such unexpected kindness, but she knew better than most how some pains were too large for words, how some losses had to be carried in silence until they became bearable enough to share. Outside, snow continued to fall in steady curtains, adding to drifts that already reached the cabin's windows. Winter had settled over the forest like a siege, transforming the world into something beautiful and deadly. But inside, warmth held. The cold at bay, and two exiles had found something that might, with time and care, become what they had both lost in different ways. "Halvar," she said, as he prepared to step outside for his daily check of the rabbit snares. "Yes, thank you for everything, for—" She gestured around the cabin, then at herself. "For seeing me as worth saving." He paused at the door, one hand on the latch, and for a moment she thought he might say something profound about redemption or second chances. Instead, he simply nodded. "Everyone is worth saving, Inga. The tragedy is how rarely any of us get the chance to prove it." Then he was gone into the swirling snow, leaving her alone with the crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of new life, growing within her. Above the hearth, the ancient axe kept its silent vigil, a reminder of violence set aside in favor of something better. Inga found the wooden toy horse by accident, tucked behind a stack of preserved meat in the cabin's small storage room. Her hands were searching for the herbs Halvar used to brew their evening tea when her fingers closed around the small carving, no bigger than her palm. She pulled it into the lamplight and felt her breath catch. Someone had crafted this with extraordinary care. Every muscle in the tiny horse's frame suggested motion. Every detail from the flowing mane to the alert ears spoke of love, made tangible in wood. The surface had been polished to silk smoothness, darkened by years of small hands that had once traced these same curves. "Where did you find that?" Halvar's voice came from the doorway, but when Inga looked up, she barely recognized the man who had shared quiet conversations with her over the past weeks. His face had gone pale as winter bone, his massive frame rigid, with a tension that made the air itself feel fragile. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, holding out the toy. "I was looking for the chamomile tea leaves, and it was just there behind—" "Don't." The word came sharp as a blade's edge, stopping her mid-sentence. Halvar stepped into the storage room, his eyes fixed on the wooden horse as if it might transform into something dangerous. "Don't apologize. I thought I had put all of his things away where they couldn't be found." His things. The possessive pronoun hung between them like smoke, heavy with implications that made Inga's heart ache for reasons she couldn't yet understand. Halvar. His name was Magnus. The words came quiet, careful, as if speaking them too loudly might shatter whatever control he was maintaining. "My son. He would be 23 years old now if he had lived." The toy horse seemed to grow, heavier in Inga's hands, transforming from simple carved wood into something precious beyond measure, a father's love made manifest, a child's joy preserved long past the time for playing. "I made that for his 4th birthday, Halvar continued, sinking into the wooden crate that served as seating in the small space. Even sitting, he towered over her, but somehow he seemed smaller now, diminished by memory. Spent weeks getting the proportions right, the expression in the eyes. He had been fascinated by the war horses in our Lord's stable, the way they moved, their power and grace. Inga remained motionless, afraid that any movement might break the spell that had opened. This door into his past. In all their conversations, Halvar had revealed himself in carefully measured portions. This felt different, rawer, more dangerous to both speaker and listener. "He carried that horse everywhere," Halvar said, a ghost of a smile touching his weathered features. "To meals, to bed, even to the privy. His mother, Astrid, used to scold him about it, but I secretly loved watching him gallop it across tables and windowsills, making the sounds of battle and adventure." "What happened to him?" The question slipped out before Inga could stop it, and she immediately regretted the intrusion. But Halvar didn't seem to hear, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the cabin walls. "Raiders came in the spring. We had grown comfortable, perhaps careless. Our lord was away on campaign, and the village defenses were—" He shook his head. "It doesn't matter now why they were inadequate. They came at dawn, when most people were still abed. By the time we organized resistance, they had already taken what they wanted. His hands clenched into fists large enough to crush skulls, and Inga saw the terrible restraint it took for him to keep his voice level. I was away, hunting when it happened, came home to find the words caught in his throat like fishbones, too large and sharp to swallow. I found Astrid first. She had fought them. There was blood on her hands, scratches on the raiders' faces. She died protecting our home, protecting Magnus. The silence that followed felt sacred, heavy with grief, too large for any words. Inga clutched the wooden horse tighter, understanding now why it had been hidden away, why touching it had transformed Halvar from gentle giant to broken man. "And Magnus?" she whispered. "I found him in the root cellar where Astrid had hidden him. The raiders never discovered the entrance. She had died before she could be forced to reveal it." Halvar's voice became mechanical, clinical, as if distance were the only way to speak these truths. He was still alive when I reached him, still clutching that wooden horse. But the fear, the sound of his mother dying above while he hid in darkness, it had broken something inside him. "Children can recover from trauma," Inga said softly. "With time and love." He lived for 6 more days. Halvar's interruption was gentle but final. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak, just lay there holding that horse, staring at nothing. On the 7th morning, I woke to find him cold beside me. The healers said his heart simply stopped beating. That sometimes, when the soul suffers wounds too deep to heal, the body follows. Inga felt tears on her cheeks, warm against skin, suddenly cold with understanding. Here was the source of Halvar's exile, the reason a warrior had hung up his weapons and fled to solitude in the deep woods. Not cowardice, but a grief so complete it had unmade him. "I buried them together," he continued, as if her tears had given him permission to finish the story. "Astrid and Magnus, under the old oak where he used to play with that horse. Then I took my axe and hunted down every raider I could find. Took me 3 months to track the last of them, and then I realized I had become exactly what killed my family. A man who solved problems with violence, who took what he wanted and left destruction in his wake. The raiders had families too, people who loved them, children who would grow up fatherless because of my revenge." He looked directly at her then, his pale eyes bright with unshed tears. "I threw my weapons into the deepest part of the lake and walked away from everything I had ever known." Inga understood now why he lived alone, why he had hesitated before helping her, why every act of kindness seemed to cost him something precious. He was a man trying to build something good on the foundation of terrible loss, trying to become worthy of the family he couldn't save. "You think you failed them," she said. "I know I did. A father's duty is to protect his children. A husband's duty is to keep his wife safe. I was hunting rabbits while they died in terror. You were providing for them, bringing food home. That's protection too." Pretty words don't change what happened. Inga rose carefully, her growing belly making quick movements impossible, and crossed to where he sat. Without asking permission, she placed the wooden horse in his massive hands, watching his fingers close around it with infinite gentleness. "My grandfather used to say that we honor the dead not by carrying their deaths like stones around our necks, but by living in ways that would make them proud." She settled beside him on another crate, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to crowd his grief. "Do you think Magnus would want you to spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for not being able to do the impossible?" "I should have been there, yes, and I should have been wiser about Eric's promises, and my parents should have chosen love over reputation. The world is full of things that should have been different." She placed a gentle hand on his arm, feeling the tension in muscles that could have broken her without effort. But that little boy loved his father enough to hold on to this horse even while he was dying. That's not the love of a child who thinks he was abandoned. That's the love of a child who knew he was cherished. Halvar stared at the wooden horse, his thumb tracing the curves he had carved 20 years before in hope and joy. Sometimes I think I can still hear him playing. The sound of hoofbeats galloping across the floor, the little voice making battle, cries and victory songs. Maybe you can. Maybe love is stronger than death, and the echoes of joy last longer than the echoes of sorrow. They sat together in the quiet storage room, two people carrying losses too heavy for one heart to bear alone. Outside, wind howled through the pines, but inside, surrounded by preserved food and necessary supplies, something fragile and precious was being shared. The terrible weight of caring for someone who could not be saved, and the even more terrible, a burden of continuing to live when living felt like betrayal. I named this place after him, Halvar said finally. Magnus's Rest. Sometimes I pretend he's still here, still playing in the shadows between the trees. Maybe he is, Inga said. Maybe the best parts of the people we love never really leave us. Maybe they just change form, become the gentleness in our hands, the mercy in our choices, the reason we save drowning girls instead of letting the current take them. Halvar looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. You have an old soul, Inga Eriksson, old enough to recognize another one. She smiled through her tears, old enough to know that sometimes the most broken people are the ones who understand how to heal. The wooden horse gleamed in the lamplight, a testament to love that persisted beyond loss, beyond guilt, beyond the terrible certainty that some wounds never fully heal. But perhaps, Inga thought, healing wasn't about forgetting pain. Perhaps it was about learning to carry it in ways that didn't destroy the capacity for new joy. In the depths of winter, in a cabin built on sorrow, two exiles had found something neither had dared hope for, the possibility that their broken pieces might somehow fit together into something whole enough to face whatever storms still lay ahead. The fever came in the deep of winter, when snow lay heavy enough to bow the pine. Branches and the world outside the cabin had become a study in white silence. Inga woke one morning, with her skin burning like forge-heated metal, her vision swimming with dark spots that danced at the edges of sight. Halvar, she whispered, but her voice came out as barely a breath. The baby within her had gone still, as if sensing the danger that threatened them both. She tried to sit up and immediately collapsed back onto the rough mattress, her head spinning with a sickness that seemed to originate in her very bones. Somewhere through the haze of fever, she heard Halvar moving about the cabin, preparing their morning meal, unaware that death had crept in during the night to claim what the stream had failed to take. Halvar. This time she managed more volume, though the effort left her gasping. Heavy footsteps crossed the wooden floor, and then his massive frame filled the doorway to the sleeping alcove. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know. "How long have you felt unwell?" His voice remained calm, but she caught the edge of controlled panic underneath, the tone of a man who had lost too much to accept losing more. "Just now. I woke up and everything was—" Her words dissolved into coughing that felt like broken glass in her chest. When she pulled her hand away from her mouth, dark spots stained her palm. Blood. Halvar crossed to the small chest where he kept his supplies, moving with the focused intensity of a warrior preparing for battle. But this was an enemy that couldn't be faced with strength or steel. This was the kind of foe that had taken his son, invisible and implacable. "We need to cool the fever," he said, more to himself than to her. From the chest, he pulled a leather pouch that clinked softly with dried herbs, the tools of a healing knowledge she hadn't known he possessed. "Astrid taught me," he said, catching her surprised look. "My wife was the village healer before everything changed. She said, Illness was just another kind of wound, and wounds could be closed if you knew the right songs to sing. His hands, so large they seemed capable only of destruction, worked with surprising delicacy as he prepared tinctures and poultices. Inga watched through fever-bright eyes as he measured dried willow bark with the precision of a scholar. Crushed juniper berries between his palms, muttered words in the old tongue that sounded like prayers or incantations. "This will taste like tree bark and regret," he said, holding a steaming cup to her lips, "but it should help with the fever." The bitter liquid burned going down, but within minutes she felt something shift in the furnace that had consumed her. From within, not coolness exactly, but a dampening of the flames that had threatened to consume her completely. "Better?" Halvar asked, settling beside her with a bowl of cool water and clean cloth. "A little." She closed her eyes as he placed the damp fabric against her forehead, the simple touch more comforting than all the medicines in the world. "How do you know so much about healing?" 15 years alone in the wilderness teaches a man to tend his own wounds, body and spirit both. He refreshed the cloth, his movements gentle despite hands that could have crushed stone. "And Astrid, she used to make me help with difficult cases, said healing was too important to leave only to women, that men needed to learn there were ways to touch the world besides breaking it." As the fever gradually retreated under his ministrations, Inga found herself studying this man who had become her unlikely salvation. She had seen him as gentle giant, as broken warrior seeking redemption, but now she glimpsed another layer, the student who had learned love through watching his wife heal, who carried her knowledge like a sacred trust. "Tell me about her," she said softly, "about Astrid." Halvar continued his careful tending, but she saw something soften in the line of his shoulders. She was stubborn, infuriatingly, wonderfully stubborn. When she decided something needed healing, nothing could dissuade her. Broken birds, wounded soldiers, even me when I came home from campaigns thinking violence was strength. He paused to wring out the cloth, and Inga caught a glimpse of the man he must have been then. Younger, harder, not yet carved hollow by loss. "I was not an easy man to love," he continued, "full of pride and anger, convinced that might made right, but Astrid saw something in me worth preserving, worth teaching. She'd patch up the men I injured in training, then lecture me about the difference between strength and brutality while she worked. She sounds wise, wiser than I deserved. She used to say that every person was carrying invisible wounds, and that most cruelty came from people trying to pass their pain to someone else, rather than learning to heal it properly. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Here he was, using her knowledge to heal the woman who had become the closest thing to family he'd had in 20 years, while outside their sanctuary the winter wind carried traces of the very violence he'd once embodied. "The baby," Inga whispered, suddenly remembering the stillness in her womb. "Is it?" Halvar's massive hand settled gently over her belly, and they both held their breath in the silence that followed. Then, movement, a flutter, then a strong kick against his palm, as if the child were announcing its determination to survive whatever challenges faced it. "Strong," he said, and she heard wonder in his voice. "This one is a fighter. Like its mother, you said before. Like both its parents, I think. The father may have been a coward about keeping his promises, but he gave you a child with the will to live through storms that would break grown men. Through the long day that followed, Halvar tended her with the patient dedication of a monk tending sacred flames. He brewed teas that eased her breathing, prepared broths that settled her churning stomach, told stories of Astrid's healing adventures to distract from the ache in her bones. As evening approached and the fever finally broke completely, leaving her weak but clear-headed, Inga realized something had shifted between them. Not romance, that would have been impossible under these circumstances, but something deeper. They had become family in the truest sense, bound not by blood or law, but by the simple act of caring for each other when caring mattered most. "Thank you," she said as he prepared a final cup of healing tea. "For knowing how to heal, for being willing to try." Halvar settled into his chair beside the bed, the medicine pouch in his lap like a talisman against future emergencies. Astrid always said healing was just another form of fighting for life instead of against it. I've spent too many years as the wrong kind of warrior. Perhaps it's time to be the right kind. Outside, the wind had quieted, and snow fell in gentle curtains past the windows. Inside, two survivors of different storms had found something worth protecting in each other and the new life growing between them. The herbal medicine pouch lay open beside the bed, its contents a bridge between past love and present hope, proof that even the most broken people could learn to mend what mattered most. The hunters came with the spring thaw, when the world was finally releasing winter's grip, and new life pushed green through the softening earth. Inga was hanging laundry behind the cabin, baby clothes she had sewn from scraps of cloth Halvar had somehow procured, when she heard the sound of horses approaching through the forest. "Halvar," she called softly, but he was already beside her, moving with the silent grace that never failed to surprise her. His hand settled on the axe handle he'd taken to carrying again, though she noticed he didn't draw the weapon. 3 men emerged from the tree line, mounted on sturdy horses that spoke of wealth and authority. Their leader was a man Inga recognized. With a chill that went deeper than winter wind, Bjorn Eriksson, her uncle, the one who had spoken most harshly for her exile. But it was the reaction of the other 2 men that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. They were staring at Halvar with expressions of recognition, and something that might have been terror if such emotions could exist on the faces of hardened warriors. "The ghost of Raven's Hollow," one of them whispered, his voice carrying across the clearing like a death knell. "By the gods, it's really him!" Halvar went absolutely still beside her, and Inga saw something she had never witnessed in all their months together: fear. Not the healthy caution of a man aware of danger, but the deep, soul-level fear of someone whose past had finally caught up with them. "I wondered if we might find you here," Bjorn said, dismounting with the careful movements of a man who knew he was in the presence of legendary violence. "When we heard reports of a giant living in the deep woods, saving pregnant outcasts from drowning, well, the description seemed familiar." "Uncle," Inga stepped forward, instinctively placing herself between the men and Halvar. "What are you doing here?" But Bjorn's attention remained fixed on the man behind her. "Do you know who he is, girl? Do you know what he's done?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Inga looked back at Halvar, seeing him truly for perhaps the first time, not as gentle giant or broken healer, but as the warrior he had once been. The way he held himself, the careful positioning that kept all 3 men in his line of sight, the absolute stillness that spoke of coiled violence waiting for release. 23 years ago, Bjorn continued, this man led a raiding party against Raven's Hollow, burned half the village, killed 37 people including women and children, carried off everything of value we possessed. The words hit Inga like physical blows. She staggered, one hand pressed to her swollen belly, the other reaching for something solid to keep her upright. "That's not—" "He wouldn't, he would," the second hunter said, his voice carrying the weight of old hatred. "I was there that dawn when they came, barely 15 years old, but I remember his face. Remember the way he moved through our defenses like death itself given form. The ghost of Raven's Hollow," the third man spat. "That's what we called him after. The phantom who struck without warning and vanished into the forest, leaving only death and ash behind." Inga turned to look at Halvar, searching his face for denial, for some sign that these men were mistaken. Instead, she found only the terrible confirmation of guilt, shoulders bowed under the weight of old sins, eyes that couldn't quite meet hers. "It's true," he said quietly, and those two words shattered something fundamental in her understanding of the world. What they say. It's true. No. The word came out as barely a whisper. You saved me. You cared for me. You couldn't be. I was a different man then, Halvar said, and she could hear the desperate need in his voice for her to understand. Young, angry, following orders I thought were justified. I believed we were protecting our own people by murdering ours. Bjorn's voice cracked like a whip. By leaving children orphaned and families destroyed? In her hands, Inga still held one of the baby shirts she had been hanging to dry. Such a small thing, sewn with love and hope for the future, now trembling in fingers that couldn't seem to function properly. The stories you told me about raiders, about losing your family to violence, you were talking about yourself, about your own people coming for revenge. Yes, the admission came like blood from a wound. Raiders came for my village just as we had come for yours. The cycle of violence I helped create eventually consumed everything I loved. Justice, said the third hunter with savage satisfaction. What goes around comes around, as my grandmother used to say. But Inga barely heard him. Her mind was reeling, trying to reconcile the man who had pulled her from freezing water, who had tended her fever with gentle hands, who had shared his food and shelter and stories, trying to make that man fit with the monster these hunters described. How many? She asked, her voice hollow as wind through empty halls. How many what? How many children died because of what you did? Halvar flinched as if she had struck him. 7 children under the age of 10. I carry their names, their faces. I see them every night when I close my eyes. And you thought what? That saving one pregnant girl would balance the scales? That showing me kindness would somehow undo all that death? I thought... He stopped, seeming to realize how any answer would sound like justification for the unjustifiable. I thought perhaps it was a chance to be something other than what I had been. From her pack, Inga pulled out something that made all 4 men freeze, a scorched metal medallion, blackened by fire but still recognizable as the symbol of Ravenshollow. She had found it weeks ago while cleaning, tucked away among Halvar's. Possessions like a memento of conquest. You kept this, she said, holding up the medallion that had once belonged to her village's sacred hall. A trophy from the night you destroyed everything my family had built over generations. Not a trophy, Halvar said desperately. A reminder, a weight to carry, a promise to never forget. To never forget what? How good you were at killing innocents. The hurt in her voice seemed to break something inside him. His massive shoulders sagged, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked every one of his years, an aging warrior confronted with the ghosts of his choices. We should kill him here, one of the hunters muttered, fingering his sword hilt. End this now, before he can disappear again. No, Bjorn said firmly. We came to bring the girl home, not to commit murder in front of her unborn child. Home? Inga laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. To the same family that cast me out to die, to the same village that would rather see me freeze than show mercy to an unwed mother. You were wrong to lie with that merchant boy, Bjorn admitted. But you are still family, still blood. This, he gestured toward Halvar, this thing is not family. This is the destroyer of everything we hold sacred. Inga looked between the hunters who claimed to offer salvation and the man who had actually provided it. Her uncle, representing a family that had chosen honor over love, Halvar, who had chosen mercy over his past but couldn't escape the weight of what he had done. I need time to think, she said finally. I can't just think quickly, Bjorn said. We leave at dawn, with or without you, but if you choose to stay with him, you choose to be dead to us forever. No second chances, no forgiveness. The blood of Ravenshallow's children will be on your hands as well as his. As the hunters made camp at the edge of the clearing, Inga found herself caught between two impossible choices. Return to a family that had already cast her out once, or remain with a man whose gentle hands had committed unspeakable violence against her own people. The baby stirred within her womb, reminding her that this decision would shape more than just her own fate. In her hands, the scorched medallion felt heavier than mountains, a piece of metal that somehow contained the weight of cycles of revenge, of loves that transcended the sins of the past, and of the terrible truth that sometimes the people who save us are the same ones who destroyed us to begin with. Outside, spring rain began to fall, washing the last of winter's snow from the world and revealing the tender green shoots of new growth beneath. But inside the cabin, three hearts struggled with the knowledge that some winters leave scars that never fully heal, and some springs bring truths too heavy for the soul to bear. The labor pains began at midnight, as if the baby had chosen the darkest hour to make its entrance into a world already torn by impossible choices. Inga gripped the rough wooden bed frame, breathing through contractions that seemed to mirror the storm building outside, sudden, powerful, promising to reshape everything in their wake. "How long between the pains?" Halvar asked, his massive hands gentle as he helped her find a more comfortable position. Despite everything that had been revealed, despite the hunters camped outside and the weight of his past pressing down like stones, his concern for her remained absolute. "Getting closer," she gasped, then doubled over as another contraction seized her. Every few minutes now. Through the small window, she could see the orange glow of the hunters' fire, could hear the low murmur of their voices planning tomorrow's departure. Bjorn had made his ultimatum clear. Dawn would bring a choice between the family that had rejected her and the man who had saved her life but destroyed her people. Now the baby was making its own demands, refusing to wait for the crisis to resolve itself. "I can't do this," Inga whispered, fear cutting through the physical pain. "Not now, not with everything." "You can." Halvar's voice carried quiet conviction as he moved about the cabin, gathering the supplies they would need. Clean cloths, warm water, the knife he kept sharp for emergencies. Women have been bringing children into troubled times since the beginning of the world. Life insists on continuing, no matter what storms surround it. Another contraction hit, stronger than the others, and Inga found herself gripping his forearm with desperate strength. Under her fingers, she felt the scars she had never asked about, raised lines that spoke of battles fought and wounds survived. How many of those marks had come from the night he destroyed Raven's Hollow? How many were earned protecting the family he later lost to his own cycle of violence? "I keep seeing their faces," she said between ragged breaths. "The children the ones who died. How can I bring new life into the world knowing what you've done?" Halvar was quiet for a long moment, continuing his preparations with the methodical precision of someone who had learned to function despite carrying unbearable weight. "Because life is not inherited guilt," he said finally. "Your child doesn't carry the sins of anyone but themselves, and perhaps some sins can only be balanced by the protection of innocence, not by more death." The baby shifted inside her, pressing down with increasing urgency, and Inga realized that whatever philosophical struggles consumed her mind, her body had made its own decision about timing. The child would be born tonight, in this cabin built on sorrow, tended by hands that had dealt death but learned to offer healing. "The hunters will hear," she said, gritting her teeth against another wave of pain. "If I cry out, then they'll hear the sound of new life entering the world," Halvar replied. "Let them remember that not everything born in darkness comes to bring more darkness." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending sparks from the hunter's fire dancing like fallen stars. The storm Inga had sensed building all day was finally arriving. as if the elements themselves were responding to the convergence of past and future in this small wooden refuge. "Tell me about forgiveness," she said suddenly, her voice tight with effort. "Your wife, Astrid, did she ever forgive you for what you were before you met her?" Halvar's hands stilled in their work. "She said forgiveness wasn't about pretending the past hadn't happened. It was about choosing to build something better on the foundation of acknowledged truth. And did you forgive yourself?" "No." The admission came quick and certain. "Some things are too large for self-forgiveness. Some actions require a lifetime of different choices to balance the scales." Another contraction seized her, more powerful than before, and Inga felt something fundamental shift inside her body. The baby was coming whether the world was ready or not, demanding space in a reality already crowded with impossible choices and inherited pain. I need to tell you something," she gasped, reaching for his hand. "Before the baby comes, before I decide what happens next." Halvar settled beside her, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight and something that might have been hope. "Tell me. That night, when you pulled me from the stream, I was ready to die, ready to let the cold take both of us rather than face whatever lay ahead." Her grip tightened on his fingers. "But you didn't let that happen. You chose to save us even though you didn't know who I was, even though helping me brought your past to your door." "Inga, let me finish." Another contraction cut through her words, but she pushed through it. "You told me that some sins are too large for forgiveness, but you also told me that mercy is rare in this world, and that maybe it's never too late to become who you should have been." The baby pressed down harder, and she felt her body preparing for the final stages of labor. Soon there would be no more time for words, only the primal work of bringing new life into uncertain circumstances. "The children who died in Raven's Hollow, I can't speak for them. I can't absolve you of their blood." Tears mixed with sweat on her cheeks. "But I can speak for the woman you saved, and the child you helped bring safely into the world. That has to count for something in whatever accounting the gods keep." Thunder rolled across the sky like the footsteps of giants, and lightning illuminated the clearing in stark white flashes. Through the window, Inga could see the hunters stirring around their fire, no doubt discussing whether to seek shelter or trust their luck against the storm. "They're going to try to take me," she said, understanding the choice that awaited with tomorrow's light. "My uncle won't leave without me." "I know." Halvar moved to the window, his massive frame filling the opening as he studied the men outside. "And I won't be able to stop them without becoming the thing I've spent 20 years trying not to be." What if there was another way? He looked back at her, eyebrows raised in question, but another contraction chose that moment to arrive with overwhelming force. Inga doubled over, feeling her body preparing for the final stage of its ancient work. "The baby!" she gasped. "It's time!" What followed was a dance as old as humanity itself, the careful choreography of birth attended by hands that had learned gentleness through loss, witnessed by the storm that raged outside as if the heavens themselves were laboring to bring forth something new. Through the pain and effort, Inga found herself thinking about cycles, violence begetting violence, love growing from loss, new life emerging from the ruins of old certainties. The child pressing toward birth would be born into a world where its mother's protector was also her people's destroyer, where family meant both unconditional love and conditional acceptance. But perhaps that was simply the human condition, to be born into complexity, to make choices that shape the world for those who came after. Another contraction, stronger than all the others, and she felt the baby's head crowning. Halvar's voice, steady and encouraging, guiding her through the final pushes. The storm outside reaching its crescendo just as new life prepared to take its first breath. "I can see the head," Halvar said, wonder replacing worry in his voice. A few more pushes and the baby slipped free in a rush of fluid and relief, immediately announcing its displeasure with the world through lusty cries that seemed to shake the cabin walls. Halvar caught the tiny form in clean cloths, his massive hands impossibly gentle as he cleared the child's airways and tied off the cord. "A son," he said softly, placing the baby on Inga's chest. "You have a son." Through exhaustion and overwhelming joy, Inga looked down at the small face already screwed up in indignation at the circumstances of his arrival. He was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a voice that proclaimed his determination to be heard despite being born into exile and uncertainty. "Hello, little warrior," she whispered, brushing his dark hair with trembling fingers. "Welcome to the storm." Outside, the hunters' voices rose in consultation, no doubt disturbed by the sounds of childbirth and wondering what morning would bring. Inside, 3 people contemplated the new equation that had just entered their lives. A child born in the space between past sins and future possibilities, cradled by hands that had learned healing through loss. The baby quieted as she held him. Close, his small fist grasping her finger with surprising strength. In that grip, she felt the weight of choices yet to be made, of the legacy she would leave him, of the story that would begin with his first dawn. But for now, in the aftermath of labor and surrounded by the tools of simple survival, there was only this, the miracle of new life insisting on hope despite all evidence that the world was too broken to deserve it. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, something precious and irreplaceable had taken root in the space between. What was and what might yet be. Dawn came grey and unforgiving, with the storm's fury finally spent and the world dripping with its aftermath. Inga woke to the sound of men moving outside the cabin, boots squelching through mud, horses snorting and stamping, the metallic clink of weapons being checked and readied. Beside her, the baby slept in the cradle Halvar had hastily constructed, from pine boards and soft furs. Even in sleep, the infant's face held an expression of fierce determination, as if he understood that his first day in the world would also be his first battle. "They're preparing to leave," Halvar said softly from his position by the window. He had not slept, had spent the night alternating between tending mother and child and watching the hunters' camp. "Your uncle is saddling a 4th horse. For me." Inga struggled to sit up, her body still weak from labor, but her mind crystalline clear. Through the night, while nursing her son and listening to the storm's fury, she had made her choice. "Halvar, I need you to understand something." The door burst open without warning, admitting Bjorn Eriksson and his 2 companions. All 3. Men wore mail shirts and carried drawn swords, their faces set in the hard lines of those who had come to do unpleasant but necessary work. The hunters had been gone for barely an hour when the second wave arrived. Not family this time, but something far more dangerous. Inga was nursing the baby by the window when she saw them emerge from the forest, like wolves scenting blood. A dozen armed men wearing the colors of Lord Eriksson, her father's distant cousin and the regional authority. "Halvar." Her voice carried quiet urgency as she watched the men spread out in a practiced formation around the clearing. These weren't village hunters driven by family honor. These were professional soldiers following orders. Halvar appeared beside her instantly, his pale eyes taking in the tactical situation with the swift assessment of his warrior years. "Bjorn went straight to the Lord's Hall," he said grimly. "Told them where to find the ghost of Raven's Hollow." The lead soldier, a grizzled captain with scars mapping his weathered face, called out across the clearing, "Halvar Grimson, by order of Lord Eriksson, you are commanded to surrender yourself for crimes against the realm." "What do they want?" Inga whispered, though she suspected she already knew. "Justice," Halvar replied, but his voice carried the weight of inevitability. or what passes for it when the powerful decide to settle old accounts. The baby finished nursing and settled against her shoulder, his small warmth a reminder of everything that hung in the balance. Through the window, she could see archers taking position among the trees, enough firepower to turn the cabin into kindling if Halvar chose to resist. There's still time, she said desperately. The back trail through the pine grove, you could disappear into the deep forest before they close the circle. Halvar shook his head slowly. Running would only delay the inevitable, and it would leave you here to face their questions about harboring a wanted man. His massive hands moved with surprising gentleness as he touched the baby's dark hair. I won't make you complicit in my escape. Grimson, the captain called again. Show yourself. We know you're in there. What about your weapons? Inga asked, glancing toward the ancient axe that still hung above the fireplace. You could fight with what? Halvar gestured toward the wall where his legendary axe waited. That blade has been 20 years without blood. I've been 20 years learning to be something other than a killer. Would you have me throw that away now, become the monster they remember instead of the man I've tried to become? The baby stirred against her shoulder, making soft sounds that somehow seemed to echo the impossible choice facing them. Outside, she could hear the soldiers, moving closer, their patience wearing thin. You have something to live for now, she whispered. A reason to fight. No. His voice carried quiet certainty. I have something to die for, if necessary. But that's not the same as something to kill for. Before she could protest, Halvar moved to the cabin door and lifted the heavy bar that secured it. The ancient wood creaked as he pulled it open, revealing himself to the armed men who had come to claim him. Captain Thorson, he said, recognizing the scarred leader. It's been a long time. Not long enough, Ghost. The captain's hand rested on his sword hilt, but he made no move to draw it. 23 years I've carried orders to bring you to justice. 23 years of hunting shadows and following cold trails. And now you found me. Halvar stepped fully into the doorway, his massive frame filling the opening. What are Lord Ericsson's terms? No terms. Surrender yourself, and the woman and child remain unharmed. Resist, and he gestured toward the archers hidden among the trees, and you'll kill innocents to reach one guilty man. Halvar's voice carried no judgment, only weary recognition. Some things never change. From her position by the window, Inga watched this deadly chess match unfold, her son sleeping peacefully in her arms, despite the violence that circled them like hungry wolves. She understood now that this moment had been inevitable from the instant she chose to stay, that loving someone meant accepting the full weight of their past, including consequences that might demand everything. There's another way, she called out suddenly, moving to stand beside Halvar in the doorway. Both men turned to look at her, one scarred by years of following orders, the other marked by decades of carrying guilt. The baby in her arms seemed impossibly small against the magnitude of the forces arrayed against them. Captain, she continued, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to choke her. This man saved my life and helped deliver my child. Whatever crimes he committed 23 years ago, he has spent every day since trying to atone for them. Isn't that worth something in Lord Ericsson's justice? The dead of Raven's Hollow might disagree, Thorson replied, but something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely unmoved by her words. The dead are beyond our help, Inga said firmly. But the living still have choices to make about what kind of world we leave for our children. She held up her son, letting the soldiers see his peaceful face, the innocence that would be shaped by whatever happened in the next few minutes. This child will grow up knowing that his first day in the world was marked by violence or by mercy. That choice belongs to you now, Captain. What legacy do you want to leave? The silence that followed stretched taut as a bowstring. In the trees, archers waited for the order that would end this standoff in blood and fire. In the doorway, a reformed warrior stood ready to surrender rather than return to the path of violence. And in the space between past sins and future possibilities, a newborn child slept on, dreaming whatever dreams come to those too young to understand that sometimes the most important battles are won, not through strength of arms, but through the courage to choose mercy when vengeance would be easier. The moment balanced on the edge of decision, and everyone present understood that what happened next would determine not just the fate of 3 people, but the kind of story that would be told about this day for generations to come. 5 years later, the carved name stone caught the morning light like a promise fulfilled. Halvar Eriksson, the letters read, carefully etched into smooth river rock by loving hands that had learned patience through practice. Below the name, Inga had carved a simple horse, not unlike the wooden toy that still held place of honor on their mantle, but galloping forward instead of standing still, as if racing toward a future bright with possibility. The boy himself sat, cross-legged in the garden patch behind their expanded cabin, his dark hair catching sunlight as he carefully tended the bean plants that would feed them through the coming winter. At 5, young Halvar had his mother's stubborn determination, and something that might have been his namesake's quiet strength, though it showed itself in gentle hands that coaxed life from soil rather than dealing death to enemies. Papa Halvar, the child called, using the name that had evolved naturally from their first awkward attempts at defining their unusual family. Come see how tall the beans are growing. The man who had once been called the ghost of Raven's Hollow emerged from the cabin's shadow, moving with the careful gait of someone whose body carried the accumulated weight of 60-plus winters. His hair had gone completely white in the 5 years since that dawn when soldiers had come calling, but his pale eyes still held the clarity that came from finding purpose worth the price of redemption. "Taller than you soon," he said, settling beside the boy with the creaking joints of age meeting happiness. "Your mother chose the seeds well." Through the open cabin door, they could hear Inga humming as she prepared their midday meal, a sound that still filled Halvar with wonder, even after years of listening to it. The girl who had been cast out for bringing shame to her family had grown into a woman whose presence turned their forest clearing into something that felt like home in ways he had never experienced before. "Tell me again about the name stone," young Halvar said, as he did most days when the work was finished, and the 3 of them sat together in the clearing that had become their world. Inga emerged from the cabin, wiping flour from her hands on a cloth that had once been part of her grandfather's shirt, another piece of their makeshift family's collection of transformed memories. "Which part of the story do you want to hear today?" "The part about Captain Thorson," the boy said immediately, "and how he chose mercy. It had become their evening ritual, this sharing of the story that had shaped their lives, not the sanitized version suitable for very young ears, but the full truth of how violence could transform into protection, how guilt could become the foundation for better choices, how love could grow in the spaces between old wounds and new hopes. Captain Thorson was a good man caught in bad circumstances," Inga said, settling on the wooden bench Halvar had built beneath the spreading oak that shaded their home. "He had orders to arrest Papa Halvar, orders that came from people who believed justice meant punishment rather than redemption." "But he didn't follow the orders," young Halvar said, though he knew the story by heart. "No, he didn't." Halvar's voice carried the gratitude that came from understanding how close they had all come to a very different ending. "He looked at you in your mother's arms, and he chose to see the future instead of the past. He told Lord Eriksson that the ghost of Ravenshollow had died years ago, and only a hermit remained, a hermit who had harmed no one and helped many. It wasn't the complete truth, of course. Thorson had extracted promises that Halvar would never leave their forest clearing, that he would report any contact with the outside world, that he would live the rest of his days in what amounted to comfortable exile. But exile shared with love felt like freedom, and restrictions accepted willingly became choices rather than chains. "And that's when you decided to name me after Papa Halvar," the boy continued, reaching for his namesake's massive hand with the unconscious trust that marked their relationship. "That's when I realized that names are like seeds," Inga said, watching. Her son traced the scars on Halvar's knuckles with curious fingers. They carry the potential for what might grow, not just echoes of what came before. Your name carries the best of what Papa Halvar became, not the worst of what he was. The name stone glinted in the afternoon sun, a marker not just of identity, but of transformation. Proof that even the most broken people could learn to build rather than destroy, to nurture rather than harm, to leave legacies measured in love, given rather than damage inflicted. "Will I be a warrior like Papa Halvar was?" Young Halvar asked, the question that visited him more frequently as he grew old enough to understand that his namesake carried stories too complex for childhood. "You'll be whatever kind of man you choose to become," Halvar said gently. "But I hope you'll be the kind who protects rather than conquers, who builds rather than destroys, the kind who understands that true strength comes from knowing when not to use the power you possess." As evening approached and the family prepared for another night in their forest sanctuary, they could hear the distant sound of travelers on the trade route that passed near their clearing. Sometimes merchants would stop to trade goods for Halvar's woodwork or Inga's herb knowledge. Sometimes families would shelter in their clearing during storms, accepting hospitality from the strange household that had made peace from the fragments of shattered lives. They had become legend in their own quiet way. The giant who had traded, warfare for craftsmanship, the cast-out girl who had chosen mercy over vengeance, the child who carried a warrior's name but learned gentleness as his first lesson. Travelers carried their story along the trade routes, transforming it with each telling until it became something larger than the simple truth of three people who had found family in the space between what was and what might yet be. But here, in their clearing, surrounded by the garden, they tended together and the home they had built from salvaged dreams. The truth was simpler and more precious than any legend. They had each other. They had tomorrow. They had proof that sometimes the most profound victories are won not through strength of arms, but through the courage to choose love when fear would be easier, mercy when vengeance would be simpler, hope when despair would require less faith. In the fundamental goodness that persists even in the darkest corners of the human heart, the name stone caught the last rays of sunlight. And three people who had learned to call each other family prepared to face whatever tomorrow might bring, secure in the knowledge that some bonds are stronger than blood, some choices more important than safety, and some stories worth telling. Precisely because they prove that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to believe in second chances.